The night was quiet, but inside his chest there was a storm. A young man sat cross-legged on the worn carpet of a small California bedroom, the kind of place where ambition and despair shared the same ceiling. His name was Steve, and at that moment, he was not the myth, not the visionary. He was just a boy, staring at scattered tools, a cracked notebook, and the fragile glow of an impossible dream. The walls were thin. He could hear the murmur of the television from the living room, the kind of ordinary sound that mocked his hunger. The world outside seemed satisfied with mediocrity. He wasn't, but that refusal to settle came with a price: loneliness, restlessness, a constant ache. Steve Jobs had been abandoned once, before he could even form words. Given up for adoption by parents who decided they weren't ready. That wound never truly closed. It pulsed in silence, reminding him that he was not chosen, but left behind. In the dim light of that room, he felt it again: the fear of being disposable, the terror of being forgotten. He carried that wound everywhere, through school corridors where he never fit in, through moments of brilliance dismissed as arrogance, through long nights walking alone, searching for something that would silence the void. He was clever, yes, but cleverness was not enough. He wanted power. He wanted to bend the world. But first, he had to prove that he wasn't just another boy with big ideas and empty hands. The garage became his cathedral. Not polished, not holy, but sacred in its rawness. Dust clung to the air, the smell of metal and oil mixing with sweat and hope. Alongside him, another boy, quieter, steadier Steve Wozniak. Where Jobs was restless, Wozniak was precise. Where Jobs saw the world as a stage to dominate, Wozniak saw it as a puzzle to solve. Their partnership was not born from friendship alone, but from necessity. Alone, neither had enough. Together, they had just enough to begin. They tinkered with boards and wires, feeding off scraps of stolen time and second-hand parts. Each failure was a reminder of the absurdity of their mission. Who were they to think they could change anything? Two boys in a garage, surrounded by discarded machines and forgotten tools, daring to imagine they could birth something that would outlive them. The first risk was small, but it carried the weight of betrayal. Jobs sold his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his beloved calculator. Tiny sacrifices, but sacrifices nonetheless. Money was oxygen, and they were gasping for breath. Every dollar turned into a piece of metal, a circuit, a board, fragments of an unfinished dream. Then came the silence of rejection. They showed their machine to stores, to men in suits who barely glanced at them. Some laughed, some dismissed. All doubted. To them, Jobs was just another restless dropout, another arrogant kid who would burn bright and fade fast. Each rejection pressed down like a stone, threatening to bury the fragile flame. But Jobs thrived in defiance. Doubt was fuel. Laughter was gasoline. Every no carved deeper into his hunger, into his obsession. He didn't want acceptance. He wanted domination. He wanted the very same people who dismissed him to choke on their own disbelief. Late one night, when exhaustion sat heavy on their bones, Wozniak wanted to stop. Just rest. Just pause. Jobs refused. His eyes burned, his voice sharp, his presence unbearable. He demanded more, always more, because for him, to stop was to admit the possibility of failure. And failure was death. Finally, there was a crack in the darkness. A small computer store placed an order. 50 units. Not much, but enough. Enough to turn their obsession into something tangible, something that could leave the garage and enter the world. They worked like prisoners of their own ambition. Nights bled into mornings, hands blistered, eyes hollow. Jobs demanded perfection. Every corner had to be sharp, every line clean. He wasn't just building a machine. He was building a weapon against irrelevance. Delivery day came. They stood over 50 machines, not beautiful, not yet, but alive. Jobs loaded them with trembling hands. When he drove them to the store, the van rattled like a coffin full of fragile bones. With every bump in the road, he feared it would all shatter. But the machines arrived intact, and when the store owner handed him a check, the paper shook in Jobs's hand. It wasn't just money. It was proof. Proof that his hunger wasn't madness. Proof that the world could be bent if only he pushed hard enough. It should have felt like victory. It should have tasted sweet. But even as the ink dried on that first check, the void whispered. It wasn't enough. 50 machines were nothing. 1,000 would be nothing. The world still didn't know his name. And until it did, until it vowed, he would never rest. The garage was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. Every night, Jobs paced like a predator. His friends began to avoid him. His parents worried. Wozniak sometimes regretted saying yes to this madness. But Jobs couldn't stop. He was possessed. The idea of stopping, of letting the silence return, was unbearable. He had stared into the abyss of irrelevance, and he knew what it looked like. It looked like the face of his biological parents walking away. It looked like classrooms where he was dismissed. It looked like the smirks of businessmen who never took him seriously. He swore he would never return there. So he pressed forward. With more ruthlessness, more obsession. The machines grew sleeker, sharper. Investors began to circle, curious, skeptical, tempted. Jobs pitched with fire, words laced with venom and hope. He didn't just sell machines. He sold the idea of revolution. He made them believe, even when he barely did himself. That was the first fragile victory. A store, a check, a moment of proof. But under it all, the darkness remained. Because Steve Jobs knew the truth. Beginnings are never glorious. They are desperate. They are bloody. They are built on sacrifice, rejection, and obsession. And as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he understood something terrifying. The check in his pocket was not the end. It was the beginning of a debt he would never repay. Because the first victory is not freedom. It is a chain that pulls you deeper into the abyss. A chain that demands more blood, more time, more of yourself than you thought you could give. And Steve Jobs was ready. Ready to burn himself. Ready to break others. Ready to gamble everything. Because in the end, he wasn't chasing success. He was running from silence. The first check was not salvation. It was a curse disguised as a gift. For once money entered the bloodstream, ambition became addiction. The world that once ignored Steve Jobs was beginning to listen, and he refused to let the noise fade. He spoke of visions, of machines that were not just tools, but extensions of the human spirit. Words poured out of him like fire, burning through rooms of investors and skeptics. But behind the fire, there was fear. Fear that the spark could die at any second. Fear that the fragile belief of others would collapse, and he would be dragged back into the shadows. Apple was born in a garage, but it could not stay there. The small machines that rattled down suburban streets had to evolve into something terrifying, something undeniable. Jobs demanded it, and to demand meant to sacrifice. Wozniak, his loyal partner, began to see it. Jobs was no longer satisfied with invention. He wanted control. He wanted beauty carved into every corner of the machine, even if it drove his partner mad. Circuits weren't enough. He wanted elegance. He wanted perfection. He wanted something that reflected not just the brilliance of an engineer, but the fury of an artist. He screamed at suppliers. He fought with friends. He charmed strangers, then discarded them. To build Apple meant to destroy pieces of himself and pieces of those who stood too close. And yet, in the cracks of his cruelty, something extraordinary was forming. The Apple II, not a board, not a hobbyist toy, but a real machine. a product that could sit in homes, in schools, in offices. It was bold, sleek, alive. It carried a promise no one had dared whisper. The computers were not just for the few, but for the many. Investors came, checks grew larger. Offices replaced the garage. Employees filled rooms, typing, soldering, dreaming, fearing. Jobs walked among them like a restless prophet, too intense, too demanding, too brilliant. He terrified them, but they followed. Because in his madness, there was a current too powerful to resist. The first orders came in waves, then floods, then avalanches. Apple was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Jobs stood on the edge of something he had once only fantasized about: recognition. The newspapers printed his name. Cameras pointed at his face. For the first time, the boy abandoned at birth, the boy dismissed as arrogant, was standing in the light. But light creates shadows. Success did not heal him. It deepened the void. Because even as millions flowed in, even as the world began to praise him, Jobs felt the gnawing truth. None of it was enough. The Apple II was a victory, but he despised its compromises. To him, it was too crude, too ordinary. He wanted something greater, something that would change not just the market, but humanity. He dreamed of a computer that would feel inevitable, natural, inevitable as breathing. The dream became obsession, and obsession became war. Within Apple, battles broke out, teams fractured, allies became enemies. Jobs clashed with his board, with his investors, with his own employees. His vision was pure, but purity is poison when fed to the unprepared. There were nights when Jobs stood alone in his office, staring at the prototype of what would one day be the Macintosh. A box of plastic and circuits, still unfinished, still imperfect. He touched it like a relic, as if it carried his salvation. And in a way, it did. But the world was not yet ready for it. And neither was Apple. The company that Jobs had built from a garage now threatened to devour him. His intensity turned toxic. His refusal to compromise turned allies into executioners. And then came the moment no one expected. The boy who had fought so desperately to be chosen, to be seen, to be heard, was cast out, fired from his own company, betrayed by the machine he had built, abandoned again. The silence returned. It was worse than the silence of the garage, worse than the laughter of businessmen, worse than the classrooms where he was dismissed. This silence was total, a void that swallowed him whole. He had reached the mountaintop, only to be pushed into the abyss. For most men, it would have been the end. The story finished, the ambition broken. But Jobs was not most men. The silence was unbearable, but he refused to die inside it. He carried the wound like a weapon. He built again. Next, Pixar. Companies that seemed like diversions, but were seeds of something larger. Each failure, each struggle, each betrayal carved him deeper. And in those scars, something sharper was forged. A man no longer chasing only recognition, but inevitability. When he returned to Apple, years later, it was not as the restless boy in a garage. It was as a man who had tasted ruin, betrayal, exile. A man who had bled, who had lost, who had been humiliated. A man who had learned that first victories are fragile, and final victories are illusions. The world remembers Steve Jobs as the man in the black turtleneck, unveiling machines that changed everything. But the truth is darker. The truth is that his empire was built not on triumph, but on silence, obsession, betrayal, and pain. The boy abandoned at birth never stopped running from that wound. He built machines not just to connect the world, but to drown the void inside himself. Every product was a mirror of that hunger. Every launch was a scream against the silence. And yet, in that scream, there was beauty. Because the first step the garage, the van sold, the laughter of skeptics, the trembling check, was not just the beginning of Apple. It was the birth of something more fragile, more human. The idea that from the deepest wounds, the darkest nights, and the cruelest silences, something extraordinary can emerge. Steve Jobs' first victory was not the Apple II. It was survival. Survival against irrelevance, against failure, against silence itself. But survival is not peace. It is a curse. Because once you survive the abyss, you are forever chained to it. And Jobs carried that chain until the end. His story is not one of comfort. It is not one of easy triumphs. It is a reminder that greatness comes at a price, and the first step toward it is never clean, never safe, never kind. It is a step taken in darkness, with trembling hands against the echo of your own doubts. And that first step, the one Steve Jobs took in a dusty garage, surrounded by rejection and fear, was the step that would change the world. But even then, in the quiet after the noise, in the silence after the applause, the question remained. What if he had stopped? What if he had given in? What if the silence had won? The world will never know, because Steve Jobs never allowed himself to find out.